Hi everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we are going to dip dye yarn in many different ways into two different colors to see the different kind of patterns that we can create. This is an expansion of some of the different ways you can dip dye that I talked about in Dyepot Weekly 237. There I looked at just two colors and I think I just showed two different ways. But today, we're gonna do a lot of combinations of dip dyeing yarn into two different colors. Today, we are gonna explore two different techniques really when it comes to dip dyeing. One of them is gonna involve just dipping one end of the yarn into our dye at a time, and then we'll shift the skein to create different types of colorways. The other way is going to be to fold this in half and to dip dye two ends at a time. So this is two ends, and over here this is technically two ends as well. And so those are the two main ways we will be exploring today. So right off the bat, we will be creating two different colorways with our first color. But then there's many different ways we can shift and place the second color that will result in very different types of colorways. Or very related and similar in many ways, but then when we actually look at it, we'll be able to see the differences. To make it easier to compare the different colorways to one another, I am going to be dyeing 20-gram mini skeins today. We'll be using Crazy 8 from Wool to Dye For. This is a DK weight yarn that is a really fun, bouncy twist, and it is 100% superwash merino. I am pre-soaking the yarn in some plain tap water overnight, just so that way the yarn is really, really well saturated. For a bit of simplicity, today I'm going to use the Wilton Colorite food coloring system for our examples. However, you could absolutely do this with acid dyes with extremely similar results. In order to dye yarn with food coloring, you need to make sure that you have a protein-based yarn. The superwash wool we're using today is perfect, but this won't work on cotton or acrylics. We'll need to have heat, which we'll use on the stove. And just like with acid dyes, we'll need some acid. So I'll be using some white vinegar today to make the solutions acidic enough so that way the food coloring can bind to the yarn. This happens to be my favorite brand of food coloring, absolutely not sponsored, but ultimately, whatever brand you pick in the US will use the same molecules, so you can get similar results. They just might have different amounts of potency as what these have. Today, I'm going to use base pink, which is just red number 3, and base blue, which is just blue number 1. These two colors have similar potencies when mixed. Maybe it leans a little bit on the blue side, but I think that we'll be able to create some really beautiful colors just with these two. But using this food coloring is going to make it really easy for me to scale up the amount of color or down the amount of color I have in the pot based on if I'm going to be dipping 2, 3, or 5 mini skeins at a time. But I'll talk about the proportions in a moment. One other thing I really want to note is that different food coloring molecules will bind to the yarn at different rates. Now, when we're dealing with a mixture, say Wilton's Violet, if we were to dip dye into that, you would see the pinks bind first and then the blues bind later on. And this effect is known as color breaking. Since the base pink and the base blue are both primaries in that they only have one colored molecule in there, we're not going to be seeing breaking here today, but some of the colorways that we end up with might be very reminiscent of a broken colorway. We absolutely could consider this project with dipping into two different mixtures that break at a later date. That would be really awesome and really fun, but let's stick with something a little simpler as we look at how we layer the colors together. Since blue number 1 needs more heat and time to bind than the red number 3 and the pink, we are going to start by doing the dip dye into pink, and then since the yarn will already have some acid in it, and then we'll probably want to add more acid to the pot, we're going to do the blue second. Since we're using food coloring today and everything I'm using is food safe, I'm comfortable using my kitchen pots and pans. But please, if you're going to use commercial acid dyes or anything that isn't food grade, please make sure that you use dedicated dye equipment. In this pot, I have 8 cups of water, and I'm going to add 1 tablespoon of white vinegar. And we are going to bring this to a boil before we go ahead and add the dye, because our red number 3, this base pink, really likes to crash out of solution in acidic conditions. So I like to add it to the pot very close to when I add the yarn. Now we're going to start off by dyeing 6 20-gram mini skeins. And so in a 1/4 cup of water right here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm going to add 6 drops of the base pink, and then we're going to stir it up. So I am only using 1 drop of pink per mini skein because that's a really easy way to calculate out the proportions. Okay, I have squeezed out the pre-soak from a set of 6 of the mini skeins. I'm going to add our pink dye in, give it a quick stir, and then we are going to come in and start dip dyeing immediately. Moving the yarn through a little bit. These aren't going to be perfectly identical, but we do want good coverage. Now, the thing about this red 3 is that it strikes really fast. I don't mind if we have some white at the end or not, but you can see just how much that water has cleared, and it hasn't even been, I think, 30 seconds yet. This color just really binds, and actually in some cases with my tap water that is slightly acidic, well, we're about clear, it'll start to strike without any acid at all. So I do want to make sure that the colors are nicely set, but one thing that maybe you can see, there's a little bit of a pink halo around that outside edge, and that is a result of some of the color starting to crash out of solution. I am going to go ahead and add all the yarn and let it sit in the pot for probably about 5 minutes, even though we will be setting the colors more as we proceed. But yeah, so we'll come back in 5 minutes. While we wait, I want to take this opportunity to give a huge shout out and thank you to the ChemKnits Fiber patrons, including Claire, Karen Siegel, and Jessica Parko. And you'll see some of the names of the Fiber patrons on the screen right now. Patreon is a platform where fans can support content creators they really enjoy. And in terms of the ChemKnits Patreon, I offer some really cool perks like early access to the Dyepot PS series, which stands both for Postscript and Patreon special. Fun fact. There's some behind the scenes sneak peeks every month, and depending on the level you get, there's more perks like advance notice of shop restocks and more. You can find all details on the ChemKnits Patreon. There will be a link down in the video description. Patrons, thank you so much for supporting the content here on the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel. The 5 minutes are up, and here is our pink dip dye. This is probably the last time all of these skeins will look identical, but we will shift them together and then do the next dip of many of them together at the same time. All right, now let's reset to do another round. As we heat back up, this time we're gonna do 5 mini skeins. So I'm gonna do 5 drops. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I recommend keeping your cups and food coloring not directly on your counter, but on top of a plate or something, because the red 3 can stain. But once we bring this back up to a little bit of a simmer, then we'll do round 2. Okay, I'm gonna reduce the heat. I'm gonna come in with the color, stir things up. I feel like normally I would do a second round like this as a time lapse instead of also setting it up, but the dye binds so quickly that I don't think it's a problem. Now, one reason why I wanted to do this in a few rounds is so that way we can compare the different skeins, the different dips to each other, because there will be differences in that as well. And we are basically clear already. When it comes to the blue, I will be adding more acid into the pots because that color does strike a lot slower than what we see with this red number 3. But we're gonna go ahead and let this sit for 5 minutes. You'll probably notice that I do have the skeins connected with a reusable nylon zip tie. These are ones that have never been used with acid dyes, or if they have any color, it's only been from food coloring. They're 100% nylon, they work great. And in something like this, especially with mini skeins, it means that as I move things in the pot, when it's time to lift it up, I have something to hold on to. So that way it really does help prevent tangles, and I highly, highly recommend using something like this. I prefer this over, some people will use like shower curtain hooks because it does close on itself, so therefore you won't snag the skeins on like an opening of a shower hook, but that's my personal preference. I'm now going to remove our dip dyed pink, and I like wrapping the yarn just around my tongs as I remove it because it's a way to squeeze out some liquid without touching the hot water, which helps when you want to dye in multiple steps, because then the less water in the yarn, the faster it'll cool off. But we have a third round of pink to do. All right, I've got 5 skeins of our yarn right here with a zip tie on one end. And this time we want to fold things in half and dip dye 2 ends in at the same time. And so the best way that I realized I could keep this organized is by actually adding another zip tie at this end and keeping it, they're not tight, they're still fairly loose, but then I can hold the yarn like so, and then we have our 2 ends that will go in, and we're holding on to the 2 middles. So this is what we're going to be dip dyeing next. We're still dip dyeing 100 grams of yarn, so 5 20-gram mini skeins. So I'm going to add 5 drops of the base pink in here. The difference though is more yarn will be entering the pot as we get started because it's doubled over. So it's gonna be a little bit more like proportion wise of dye to yarn, like we were dipping more skeins. But we'll come back as soon as things are hot and ready. I always like to bring my water to a little bit of a boil and then reduce the heat to get to that just below a boil temperature. I'm now adding the dye, and we're gonna stir it up. And now we're coming in with our yarn, and I'm gonna use this spoon to help me make sure that I spread things out, and I also wiggle the yarn as I dip it in. And each time I come out and go in, I add a little more. Now, one reason why I don't just slowly add without moving and I go up and down is that I find that going and doing multiple dips like this gives you a more smooth transition between the colors. And if I were to just add a little bit more at a time, then you might see like a shelf line and up. So in here we have some differences because that yarn in the middle right there was sort of trapped together. So if you want to avoid that, then you want to make sure to like separate things and wiggle everything a bit more. But this is a big proof of concept video, and let's not forget that we are going to be dyeing all of this, or some of this, in many different ways. I did dye more of the pink than I think I needed to give me flexibility once we have everything out on the counter. But now I am going to wait 5 minutes. Now I'm going to turn off the heat, lift up our yarn. You can see all the color in there has cleared, and bring out some of this extra liquid before we go for the next round. But because of the red 3s crashing out, I am going to go ahead and reset this water for the blues. Otherwise, I don't think I would necessarily bother. Actually, I might just increase the volume in a little bit, but here's what I'm going to do. We'll see how much I can get off. But just so you can see, the pinks are crashing out. Yeah, I think I am going to go and quickly wash it, just because I don't want that little bit of residue to alter the colors that we are getting in our next round. But when I come back, we will look at all of the pinks we've created and start arranging them for the next dip. Here are the two skeins from our unfolded dip, and they're reasonably similar with similar-ish amounts of white with some baby pink left and similar-ish amounts of the darker color, but they're not identical. And opening it up, there is some variation, but overall, I think it's a good comparison. As for the folded dip, when I unfold it, there are more differences in here because the color just struck so fast. And actually, yeah, it looks like one end might be shorter than the other. So it wasn't perfect, but I think that you can still start to get a point of how folding it gives you a different kind of shape than having it unfolded. Folding the skein in half just functionally makes it as though your dip dyed skein is half the length. So you're still gonna transition from light to dark and back again. It's just that that transition is gonna be happening over half the length scale. And so it'll be a shorter repeat. But now, let's plan out some different ways we can dip. I removed the zip tie, but I will put it back in when we're ready to dip again. All right, I'm gonna say that this end is gonna be the end with the zip tie, so we're gonna be dipping into the blue from this end. And I haven't shifted anything yet, but you can see that in one of them, we're gonna dip the same end into the blue. In the next, the opposite end, which this example right here is probably the dip dyeing into two colors scenario that I do the most. Next, I'm gonna take the yarn and shift it so we have our lightest edge and our darkest edge together in the middle. And this is one of the examples that I did in the last live stream. But we can shift things in other types of ways and just be a little asymmetric. And so this is more shifted than we had up there, but not quite as shifted as we had over here. And so this fifth skein right here is sort of the opposite of what I have right here. There are other ways that we could decide to dip into one color, but right now I am going to collect all 5 of these, which all 5 of these were dyed in the same batch with the pink. So they have very similar amounts of the pink. And now as we dip into the blue, they're gonna have similar amounts of that blue. Just, you know, they all are arranged differently here on the zip tie. Here are just 2 of the folded dips that I did into the pink. I only have 5 of those total, and I think what I want to do is dip these 2 into blue, starting at this end. Now, you could see how if I had more of these doubles already, I could shift them in at least like a third different way, but I don't think that I have enough to do for this round. So we're gonna focus on just dipping once into blue in this orientation right here. Now I also want to prepare for some double dips into blue. So on this one, we'll have that end go into the blue first, but I'd also like to do one, and I'm being really careful so that way I will be able to arrange these. We'll have one with the pink going in to the blue first, and then finally I'm gonna arrange one like so, so we have something that is a little more off center to dip into the blue. I guess in all 3 of these cases, these are very similar to what I discussed for the unfolded dips, but I thought that these would be fun to explore. And I am now going to pick them up and lay them out flat so I can put the zip ties back on and not tangle things. Because what I don't want as I go into the zip ties is to have something twisted and accidentally introduce more resist into our pot. Finally, we have some unfolded dips that I want to fold. And these will just create some other ways that the colors will repeat. Rotate, have like that, trying to just be organized for my zip ties. All of these situations that we are playing with will be very, very similar colorways, but the pattern and overall progression is what's going to be different. There we go. Okay. And so then on the next one, I want to shift, but not 100%, just be a little bit shifted. And then there is the opposite. So shift a little bit, but have the brightest be down at the bottom. There's a real potential for a lot of these to look really, really similar, but at the end, when I think each of these batches that I'm showing right now, those are the ones that I'll really compare to each other. When if you try to line them up, then you'll see some differences. But I'm now going to attach 2 zip ties to either end, and we'll get started dipping into blue. I realized when I was arranging this that my shifted skein in half like that, dipping from either end, that if I dip with the darkest ends going in first, that is very, very similar to something I had already had set up. So that is just worth keeping in mind. Because of just the way that the folds and the double dips are going. So I think I'm only going to be doing 4 from this stage. Yes, going back and looking at the 5 on the counter, the second and the fourth of the 5 actually are pretty much the same, just arranged differently. And so those would have created the same colorway. And so I'm going to leave out one of them just so that way I have 2 in reserve in case we need them later on. Hopefully this all isn't too confusing, but the big thing to trust is that we will be dipping in many, many different ways to create different types of colorways with just 2 colors. We have 8 cups of water, nice and hot, and I'm going to add 5 drops, 3, 4, 5, for the first batch, which has 5 mini skeins. The blue is more viscous and I think just needs a hint more stirring than the pink. And since blue does take longer to absorb, I want to start off at a concentration where it should all start binding. And so in our 8 cups of water, I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of white vinegar. Now, there's a chance that I'll regret this. On non-superwash wool, I find that the blues don't bind at all with only 1 tablespoon. But on superwash, they do. So we'll see. And the blues don't crash out, so here I am going to add the blue, stir things up. Then I'm actually going to go wash my hands to make sure I don't have any blue food coloring on them, and we'll dip. Okay, here we are. I am really, really excited to do this. And you can already see a lot of different colors because, well, we have a lot of different colors on our yarn already. And I do want to help move things around using my tongs. And each time I dip, I'm going in a little further and a little further. But I am expecting that this will take longer than our pinks did. So I just want to go nice and slow to let most of this blue absorb to that first end and make sure that the yarn has plenty of movement through. But we're already creating a nice gradient, trying to make sure we've got good coverage. Now, I would not have to add the yarn into the pot completely. We could decide to go steam set it if we aren't absorbing the color at the rates that we want. But as I start to put this lightest side in, the amount of blue that is left in here is very, very little. I do want to try to preserve a little bit that doesn't have blue, but we've already been dipping for a bit longer than we did with the pink. I have a feeling that with some of the rest of the blues, I might speed things up into a time lapse. It's so funny to not be able to tell what's going on with the colorways because I can't tell like which two are part of the same skein or not. And so that's just pretty fun. But we've got blue and purple and pink and still some white, depending on how things were arranged. And just imagine if you're gonna do this with 3 colors, the possibilities, that you would have in terms of the color that you can get. And there's very little color left, but I'm still a little hesitant to go all the way in. So actually what I'm gonna do is, briefly go all the way in, is I am going to leave this, there, leave the yarn outside of the pot a little bit, let the rest of the color in here absorb, so I'll wait about 5 minutes, but this will just mean that I'm not going to be adding that very last end into the pot. And I am going to reduce the heat because I don't want the edge of the pot to be so hot that the yarn could burn. So I will be keeping a close eye on it, but let's come back in 5 minutes. All right, after 5 minutes, the water is basically, oh dear, as I like make a mess, the water is basically clear. If I were to add the other end, I don't see any appreciable color going up. And so I am now going to remove this yarn. I'm going back and forth between being tempted to let it sit. Actually, you know, I think I will let it sit longer. After going back and forth, I decided I am gonna let this sit another 10 minutes just to be completely sure, give it some final time with heat before we remove it and set it aside. I'm being more conservative because this time I'm not planning on dipping the yarn in another time, unlike last one. The one issue I'm having today, and this isn't something I see a lot, is I appear to be siphoning out some liquid because like I mean I have a sponge to catch it, but I just am getting a lot of drips and liquid onto the center of my stove, which is not something I've seen before, and so therefore thought that that was worth pointing out. So I might add some more water with the same ratio of water to vinegar. I might add some more before the subsequent blue dips. Okay, I am going to now remove this and set it aside. And I think I will probably wait to do the like comparison of everything until the yarn is dry, just for simplicity. This is really fun right now. I mean, you can tell that there's absolutely going to be some differences between these colorways. And now I am going to reset with, believe it or not, this is just 2 drops of the blue to dip another 2 skeins. I unfolded these 2 skeins into our blue dye and then let the yarn sit in the pot with a little bit hanging out again, but let it sit in the pot for 15 minutes to make sure that that color could be really well set before removing the yarn. I didn't end up adding any more volume to our pot because It's only 2 skeins, and so I didn't think it was really necessary. But when we get ready to do the double dips, I think that I will make sure that we increase the level of water here in the pot. Before the first of the 2 rounds of folded dips, I added 4 cups of water with 1 tablespoon of white vinegar to increase the volume we had. And then for the first round of our folded dips, I used 3 drops of the blue food coloring in a 1/4 cup of water and proceeded very much like I did for the unfolded dip. With the final 4 folded skeins, I reset with 4 drops of the base blue food coloring and then slowly dipped the yarn into the pot, shimmying it a lot to try to make sure that we had good coverage. Once it was done, I left an end out of the pot and left the heat on for, well, only 7 minutes, but then I turned it off and let the yarn sit in the pot for a while longer. And truth time, I had to go to the bus stop to get Lucas. So that is why this one was treated slightly different than the rest, but it really shouldn't affect the final color at all. So what I did technique-wise was pretty simple today. The bigger difference in the variety of the colors that we see is coming from the way the yarn is arranged. But let's take a moment and imagine that I was doing this with colors that break. So for example, if I was doing Wilton's Violet and we got that pinkish purple to blue gradient and then rotated it and dipped it in a different way, in many different ways, in another color that broke, then it's not just layering 2 pigments at different depths of shade on top of each other. It's layering more colors, and you could create some really, really stunning, complex color-wise through an ultimately pretty simple technique. It's just gonna look more complex than you think it is. And so that breaking color on yarn more than once is something that I would love to explore in the future. So if you think that that sounds fun, leave a comment below and let me know. Anyway, I am now gonna let the yarn cool completely so we can go wash it, and we'll just wash everything all together. Okay, let's wash our yarn. And actually, I can remove the secondary clip from some of this double dip yarn because I don't need to have 2 on for washing. And I do have 2 minis that never had glue on them. So we might, who knows, we might decide there's something I wish I did at the very end. So it could be nice to have 2. But at first dip, there is no color bleeding. That first round of water was actually the same water that I used for the pre-soak. But now I'm going to add some clear dish soap, and we will see. I really, really like the Crazy 8 base, and actually hope to get some full skeins of it at some point. I love just the twist and the density of it, but it still has a decent yardage, so I'm excited. And there is no color bleeding. So I am going to go ahead and rinse out the soap, just showing again, put all the yarn through my Nina Soft spin dryer, hang it up to dry, and we'll come back to look at the variety of colorways we created with our techniques today. Let's take a closer look at all of the colorways we created. Here are the last 2 remaining mini skeins that we dip dyed into just the pink. These are actually from the 2 different batches where we dip dyed them once and not folded up. And although they're similar and the same colorway, you can see that the length of the pink varies just based on how I was dip dyeing it into the pot. So this can account for one kind of difference we can see between our batches. Okay, here are 5 minis that we dipped into one color and then we dipped into a second. This was dip dyed into pink and then we dip dyed into blue, both at the same side. Up here you can see that there's a little bit of, it's not really breaking because we layered 2 different colors, but you can see that it isn't completely even in tone. This skein I dip dyed half into pink and then the other half into the blue without shifting it around. This skein looks very similar. I think I must have shifted it a little bit. There's some more deepness in the pink down here, so I think that it was dipped like this into the pink and then shifted before we dipped into the blue. It's pretty, a little challenging to go back and reverse engineer it. These two had more of a rotation. This one, if we dipped, maybe the pink was like this, and then the blue, it's a little easier to figure out where the blue was, and the blue was like that. And then this one, our blue is deepest like there. So these two look fairly similar, but there's more overlap of the blue and pink on this one than there was on that one. So ultimately, moving it around, you can get things that are still pretty similar. These two are very similar. These two are very similar, but technically they are all different, and you might see more of those differences when you go to knit it. And if I try to line these two up, it doesn't quite work. You can see that there's more pink in more places in here, and that this one has more of this dark blue that is from the pink and blue overlapping. So side by side, it might look fairly similar, but there are more differences. And keep in mind, all of the dips from all of these skeins happened in the same batch. So I dipped them all in the pink at the same time, and then I dipped them all in the blue at the same time. Now, there could be differences because there were differences within the skeins, but yeah, this is some look at some of the differences. Next up, I have two skeins that I folded and dipped into the pink, and then I opened them up to dip into the blue unfolded. And we do this with the reverse, with the single pink and then dipped into the blue twice, but you can see how there could be more ways that we could have shifted this around to have things, you know, a little more skewed before dipping into the blue. But this is just yet another way to create more colors dipping into two different colors. Here are 4 examples of colors that I dipped into pink first, and then I dipped into the blue folded. So I think that this one is really, really easy to see, because here I dipped into the pink, and then you can see where I folded it and then dipped into the blue. So that is the easiest one. And now let's see if I can figure out what I did on these other 3. I mean, I can tell where the deepest pink was here, and then I rotated to dip into the blue. But I think that there are a few different ways that one could rotate the colors, and if we try to set these up so that we have the most pink all down at this one end, you can see that there's differences in the progression. So here, and maybe this needs to be a little more like this, these two actually could be, if I flip it over like that, so we've got the pink going into purple, which is bigger over there, the blue, but we still have a tiny bit of pale pink on this one that we preserved. So the rotation of these was slightly different. And then this one, the placement of the white is different. Yeah, this one has some pale pink before going into the blue. They're very similar, very, very similar, but those differences of where that palest pink is and the white vary just a hair. Again, giving us some differences. Finally, we have our 3 that were dipped, folded twice. Once into pink, once into blue. This time the pink and blue were dipped the same way, so we've got this more purple with a tiny bit of difference there in the middle. And then this one was shifted more. So in this case, where we had the pink and the blue, we don't see as much of this like deeper blurple color because the darkest colors didn't overlap. They really overlapped in a paler section. And this purpley color here comes from where we have a little more of the blue and pink pigment together. Well, all right, we've got a lot of yarn here. A lot of different variations, a lot of different colors. Hopefully when I laid them out slowly, you could see some of the differences, but I know that it was hard for me to tell, okay, which ones did I rotate like halfway versus somewhere in between, because some of the differences from just the dip dyeing could then add to the differences that we're seeing. But long story short, you can create different types of repeating or semi-repeating colorways with dip dyeing into multiple colors. And you can just vary the position of your next dips a little bit, and that can really shift the kinds of colors that you create. So whether you have something that, you know, gives you a much smaller repeat all the way around, or, you know, if you have something that goes to one color and back again versus having something where you go through multiple hues of all the colors in year round. And I just think that really playing with, all right, I keep saying we're playing with 2 colors. Technically, we're playing with 3. The yarn is white. That is a 3rd color. It's just a solid. So that is something that comes into play as we're creating these colorways. And you can see a lot of examples where the white was left behind. So, but we're playing with 2 dyes, so I'll leave it at that. But anyway, I hope that this deep dive and just quick and dirty look at the different ways that we can shift the yarn for a dip dye was helpful and really interesting. Now I'm going to go twist these up, and then it's going to be even harder to tell which color was which. I mean, I already think that it's a tiny bit hard right now to tell that, so I can imagine that once they're twisted, since most of these have the same hues in them, that it's going to be even harder. When twisted up, you can't necessarily tell the difference between some of these colors, but clearly you can tell the ones with just pink. Fine, we'll push those to the side. But some of these where the colors were layered on top of each other do look substantially different from the ones that where the colors were layered on at the opposite. So again, you can create so many different colors. And then we didn't even go into controlling the amount that you dip. And if you're going to dip faster or slower, those are other variables that can affect the colors as well. And so you can really take advantage of this to control the way that colors layer on top of one another. Anyway, I'm not sure how informative this is, but hopefully it was fun and interesting to see me shift and think through as many ways as I could to dip the yarn into these 2 different colors. Okay, I suppose that there's more ways I can think of, like folding it over and like into thirds and other things like that. But using just a single dip or a folded over dip, these are pretty much all the combinations I could think of. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and if you enjoyed this video, please go and check out the ChemKnits Patreon. It's a lot of fun. You can get behind the scenes sneak peeks, early access to the Dyepot PS series, and more. Again, there'll be a link down in the video description. And patrons, thank you so much for all of your continued support of the content that I'm creating here and supporting my yarn dyeing journey. I love being able to share this with all of you, and I really hope you're enjoying coming along on my color journey. Thank you so much for watching.